Sabico Bia Saigon Export.
And remember, life is too short to be drinking shitty beer.
Welcome to another edition of Bands, Bikes and Booze Reviews. This is a first. The first Vietnamese beer I've had on the channel. In the 3+ years that this channel has been going, I've never had a Vietnamese beer. Never been to Vietnam either, and I don't intend to. And by the way, let's get one thing out of the way before we go any further. It's pronounced Vietnam, not Vietnam. We are not American in this country yet, so we're going to pronounce it Vietnam. Okay? Get that into your head. And relax. Bia Saigon. From the biggest brewer in Vietnam, or the People's Republic of Vietnam, and it's a brewer that has got over half the market share of beer in the country. Now, Vietnam, if you don't know, has got a bit of a history. Everyone knows it, of course, for the Vietnam War in the 1960s, which started in the 1960s and ended in 1975. But there is, of course, a big history of that before. And the history of that was colonial. And it was a French colony during, well, the 1800s, since the 1800s. And a fellow called Victor Leroux, I think his name was, he founded this brewery in 1875. It wasn't called Sabico, it was called something else, but the communist government changed the name, and that's where it is now. But he founded that in 1875, and it had been brewing beer ever since. And beer in Vietnam and in the Far East, I have to say, is very, very popular indeed, and it is growing as well. I recently reviewed a Japanese beer, and doing my research, I found out there is a really big beer culture in Japan, but it's also big in places like Vietnam. Korea has got a very big beer culture as well, and generally China too has got a bit of a beer culture. So beer is on the up in the Far East. Now, I have to say, the beer that I've tried from the Far East isn't that great. It may be nicer over in them places, but the stuff that I've got over here isn't great. And to be honest, I'm sort of thinking this stuff isn't going to be good either. But we are where we are. Just a little bit about the history of Vietnam. It is quite fascinating. If you want to know the origins of the Vietnam War in the 60s, originally, put my Uncle Albert hat on here. During World War II, what was the resistance movement at the time was led by a fellow called Ho Chi Minh, and he didn't defeat the Japanese, but he gave them such a hard time that when World War II finished, he thought he'd done enough to secure the freedom of Vietnam, unfortunately, which was called Indochina at the time. That was the French name for it, Indochina. And unfortunately, the French said, we're going back. And it got really weird, because this is a little known fact. A lot of people say, why didn't Britain get involved in the Vietnam War during the 1960s with the United States? Well, here's a little interesting fact, not very well known either. Britain was actually in Vietnam straight after World War II. And there were no French colonial forces there. They'd all either been taken prisoner, executed by the Japanese, or they were too busy in France, basically liberating France, or clearing up the mess that was created by the Germans in France. So the British went into Vietnam to try and subdue these communist guerrillas. And the British didn't have enough manpower. So they actually employed Japanese prisoners of war. Can you imagine that? After fighting the Japanese for nigh on 5 years, they employed the prisoners of war, and there weren't many because the Japanese didn't take too kindly to being taken prisoner, but they employed them against the Viet Cong, or what was the forerunners to the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh's troops, and utterly defeated them. So there was no communist resistance. They'd all run away into the shadows and disbanded. Then the French came back and took over, and of course it all went to shit. Now, a lot of the occupying forces in Vietnam at the time were French Foreign Legion, and at the time a lot of them French Foreign Legion soldiers were ex-German prisoners of war. So they'd obviously had a lot of combat experience, not much jungle training experience, but they were employed by the French Foreign Legion to go out and basically subdue this communist resistance that had risen when the British and the Japanese prisoners of war had handed the colony back over to France. And the rest, as they say, is history. The French were eventually defeated in a battle in, I think it was 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where they were totally and utterly destroyed, and the country was given over to Ho Chi Minh. Of course, that was in 1954. By 1963, the Americans had sent over the CIA basically to see what was going on with the communists over there, because they were, this was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they basically said, well, I think it was Kennedy, believe it or not, he basically said, we need to go over there and sort out them commie bedwetters. And then when he was assassinated, what's name took over, Johnson took over, and yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. One of the worst campaigns that America has ever fought, which ended in them in I would say, a humiliating defeat. And the only forces that came out with any credibility were the Australians, believe it or not. The Australians, where they were posted, they done everything. Well, they basically took the copybook from the British way of winning over the hearts and minds of the locals, and with their superior tactics as well, which they'd learned from the British. They defeated the VC, or the Viet Cong, and the NVA, which was the National Vietnam Army, and basically booted them out of the region that they were. So they all redeployed against the Americans, and of course the Americans were defeated. It was just a tragic loss of life for American youth at the time. They had the draft in there, of course, and you know the history about the Vietnam War. I do find it quite fascinating, actually, and they were very turbulent times in America's history. And this beer, would you believe, was very popular with American GIs that were based over in Vietnam. And so that's where the link is, and that's given me a little bit of an outlet to inform you of the history of Vietnam. Anyway, I'm rambling. You're probably not interested. You want to know what this beer is like. So let's get on to the next section. Right, this is a 355ml bottle. You find that this is a lot of Americans use that. It's an imperial measurement, and they've chosen to put that in a 355ml bottle. It's 4.9%. Bia Saigon, original premium quality beer from Vietnam. Doesn't say it contains rice. The only alarm bell, it says it contains cereal. It does contain malt, but it also contains cereal. What that could be, I don't know. Wheat, maybe. Who knows? Is rice classed as a cereal? Not really. Rice is rice. But there you go. Can it be classed as a cereal? I don't know. I suppose you can if you can get Rice Krispies. What do I fucking know? I'm talking bollocks. So it could contain rice. Who knows? Coming from that region, I would imagine it does. They all do. They've got an excuse because malt isn't in as much abundance as it is over here. Budweiser, you've got no fucking excuse for putting rice into your beers, you fucking shithouses. Anyway, there you go. In a brown bottle as well, which is good. At least they get it. Budvar, they've teamed up with Thornbridge now. Budvar, have you seen that? And they're brewing a beer. I must try that. I want to see what that's like, because that's what you need to do. And they started saying things like, good mates don't let mates drink bad beer and stuff like that. And obviously I didn't come up with that, but it's the sort of thing I would advocate. But there you go. Anyway, not in a green bottle, so it may be okay. To be honest, I haven't got very high hopes for this, but let's see. Hopefully I'll be proved wrong. Right, let's get it open up. The reason I haven't got high hopes for it is because it's the biggest selling beer in Vietnam, and if it's the biggest selling beer in Vietnam, it is going to be brewed on a massive scale, and everything that comes with macro brewers is going to be in this bottle. Wow, that is very light. That's the first thing I notice. It's extremely light. There's the cap. It's a picture of a dragon. They love the old dragons out there, don't they? In the Far East. I think it's a sign of good luck. And red is too. Now, speaking of which, they also have, or a Thai company also has a huge stake in this Sabico brewery. They also do wine and other beers as well. And if you're a fan of Leicester City, who've just got relegated, really sorry to hear that. Beat us 2-1 last game of the season. Didn't bother us. We're in Europe, so fuck you. But the Thai owners of that club, they have sponsorship from Sabeco, and actually this beer is listed on their kits. Anyway, aroma. Yeah, very cereally. Cereally, is that an adjective? Who knows? It smells macro. Not nasty. There's a lemon citrus, but it just smells like that grain, that cheap grain you get from macro beers. It's got that. And there is a little tiny bit of that. I get it class it as a confectionery. And I was watching the craft beer channel. I could never put my finger on what it was. It's like a boiled sweet. And they said it was pear drops. And immediately I got it right. The funny thing was I was reading a story the other day about a World War I veteran, and poison gas used to have some very strange smells. Some of it smelt like pear drops. I can't remember which one it was. It wasn't chlorine gas. It was some other kind of gas that they used. Would it be mustard gas? I'm not sure. It was either mustard or chlorine. They used some terrible gases in World War I, but one of them smelt of pear drops. And he said as soon as you smelt pear drops, and he says he could never, if somebody had pear drop sweets, it really set things off in his head, apparently. But yeah, poison gas used to smell of pear drops. But yeah, that's what I'm getting. There's a very faint aroma of pear drops in there. But it's very insignificant. It's a typical macro. But proof is in the tasting. Let's get it there, my fat Gregory Peck. Bottoms up. It's very nondescript, to be honest. There's a grainy type flavour to it. Almost, I wouldn't say burnt grain, but slightly toasted grain, which sounds nice, doesn't it? But it ain't that great. There's a little bit of lemon citrus. Mouthfeel isn't bad, I have to say. The mouthfeel is not too bad. This is cold, it's come straight out of the fridge. Very slight bread type malt on there. It's okay. Now, if you was in Vietnam, of course the weather over there is really hot. These would be served ice cold, so you wouldn't really be going for the flavour. And I've sort of come to that conclusion that the beers that you get from these hot countries, Spanish beer, all the African beers, a lot of beers from the Far East, they don't really go for the flavour too much. It's all about refreshment. That's why they are served ice cold. That's why a lot of the flavour is disguised in these beers by I wouldn't say the extreme temperature they're served at, but the very cold temperature they're served at. And of course, as you know, it's scientifically proven that if you have beer at or anything really at very, very cold temperature, you're not really going to get the full flavour on there because it dulls a lot of the flavours. Let's dive in. Put it this way, I've had worse from a macro brewer, believe me. Some of the shit AB InBev have served up when it comes to lager ain't great. The lagers they're brewing over here, this is actually better. It doesn't stand out as being fantastic, but it is mildly palatable, I will say that. Now it's come out of the fridge, I won't say it's ice cold, but it's cold. And it's relatively warm in this room, and this is quite refreshing, but that's as far as it goes. Flavour wise, yeah, just not getting much at all. This is all about the refreshment, as most beers from these hot countries are. No nasties in it. Finish is meagre and meek, and yeah, this is just one for for necking when you're in a bar when the humidity's 100% and you're sweating your tits off. I imagine this would go down a treat, but aside from that, if you're looking for flavour, go elsewhere. So, what is the verdict on Bia Saigon Export? Well, I got this from Lidl's, and it was quite cheap. I think it was $1.50 a bottle. I think something like that. Wasn't that expensive, and they had loads of it there. And it's the first time I've seen a beer from Vietnam, and I thought I'm going to have to try this. So I picked it up, and I'm not majorly disappointed. I've probably got what I expected. It's a pretty nondescript beer. It hasn't got any nasties in it, I will say that. And I imagine if you're over there, it's going to be really nice if you have it ice cold, because you're not going to taste much. And with the flavour profile of that, you're probably going to taste hardly anything at the temperatures that they serve it. I mean, that if it's anything like Spain and them hot countries like Greece and the Mediterranean, it's going to be really, really cold. So, and it has to be, because it warms up really, really quickly over there, beer. But they put it in a brown bottle. Again, that gives it some credibility. And see how easy it is, Budvar. Even the Vietnamese have got this right. It's just okay. I'm not going to do cartwheels about it. I'll probably never buy it again. But I mean, it's not the worst beer in the world, I have to say. For that reason, I'm just going to give it a 5. I think that's a fair mark. It's not got any nasties in it. It's not offensive. It's not in a green bottle. Yes, it's a macro beer. The ingredients aren't probably the most select or the most expensive, but all in all, it's not about flavour with these beers. As I say, this is all about refreshment, and it does have that. So, yeah, not as bad as I thought it was going to be. So I think 5 out of 10 is a fair mark. If you want some of this, get your ass down Lidl. They're doing it on a promotion now. Don't know whether it's still there. Got this last week. Lidl, they change whatever promotions they have relatively quickly. They had Spartan there a while back, crates of it, and I bought one crate and it was absolutely gorgeous, and never seen it again since. So yeah, Lidl's beer selection is completely random. But there you go. Yeah, 5 out of 10. If you want something a little bit different that isn't that unpleasant, you'd have to serve it ice cold. Be good for the summer if you're having a barbecue. Get a load of them in. It's quite cheap. You can buy them in big crates. It's only 355 ml, so you're going to have to buy quite a lot of them. But yeah, not bad. 5 out of 10. Recommended with a little bit of caution. And remember, beer is working class champagne.